Der syrische Staat ist nur wenige Tage nach Beginn der HTS-Offensive zusammengebrochen. Noch immer erscheint es rätselhaft, wie rapide das politische System von Bashar al-Assad zusammengebrochen ist, das vor einigen Jahren noch siegreich war im Kampf gegen die islamistischen Kräfte. Warum war das syrische Militär nicht in der Lage oder sogar unwillig, Widerstand gegen die HTS-Offensive zu leisten? Warum ist Syrien zusammengebrochen wie ein Kartenhaus?
Well, I think it's very early in the process of doing the post-mortem on Assad's Syria. I certainly would like to interview Assad himself, Syrian generals, Syrian politicians, to find out what was going on in Syria, because void of such interviews, we have a lot of speculation. And so in order to answer your question, I need to acknowledge up front that it's based upon speculation, not any concrete knowledge of what the reality of Assad's government was. But what we do know is that that Bashar al-Assad inherited a regime from his father that many people considered to be already corrupt, and that corruption was backed by a level of oppression that alienated many Syrians, and led to, for instance, revolts in Homs in the early 1980s that were brutally suppressed by Hafiz al-Assad. And when Bashar al-Assad, who was not groomed to be president, took over, he was ill-prepared to deal with this reality. According to some sources, he made a concerted effort early on to try to create the conditions for a genuine democracy. He targeted some of the most flagrant centers of corruption, that being the ongoing Syrian military presence in Lebanon, which he shut down and relieved the military commander. But in doing so, he shook the corrupt edifice that was Syria to the core, because what Syria was doing in Lebanon, other Syrian generals were doing in Syria, together with politicians, basically making Syria not a unified nation, but a series of fiefdoms that existed for the financial benefit of those Ba'athist generals and politicians who were appointed to lord over those. And so Bashar al-Assad had to proceed very carefully in this. Meanwhile, the tools of oppression continued to be waged. There wasn't much Bashar al-Assad could do to stop the secret police from behaving as the secret police behaved under their father. And this further alienates a population that, instead of seeing Hafiz al-Assad's face as the head of Syria, is now looking at Bashar al-Assad and not being cognizant of what Bashar al-Assad wants to try to achieve, judges him purely on the outcome of what is. Bashar al-Assad may have succeeded in doing the reforms that he wanted. He was taken under the wing of Turkish President Recep Erdogan, who talked to him frequently. They vacationed together. By all accounts, they were very close. But in 2006, a drought hit Syria, and this drought devastated the Syrian countryside, agricultural, agronomy-based system that was there. Many Syrians fled the villages that could no longer sustain them and came to the cities, to the urban areas. And the Syrian government was ill-prepared to deal with this crisis. And this further angered the Syrian population, who was, saying that the Syrian government need to be better prepared for this. But Bashar al-Assad wasn't, and I don't know if it's his fault or if it's the fault of the people under him. But the blame rests with the government. In order to restore the viability of the Syrian countryside, Bashar al-Assad turned to Saudi Arabia, which provided funding, either directly or through various Saudi-backed charities. And much of the funding was centered on restoring the social and economic viability of these abandoned villages. And with the Saudi money, though, came the exportation of Wahhabism, Salafism, the extreme form of Islam. Mosques were built in these villages, imams were brought in who were radicalized, and you already have a population that's disaffected, that isn't inclined to be supportive of the regime of Bashar al-Assad, and now they're being radicalized by these Saudi-backed imams. And that was the reality that existed at the time of 2011 when the Arab Spring swept through the Middle East. And we saw that in Syria there were uprisings. These uprisings may have been, in some instances, the legitimate manifestation of grievances by the Syrian people, but the violent aspect of these uprisings were being promoted by outside powers, not the Syrian people themselves. And so we can't call what happened after 2011 a civil war. Many people talk about it as a civil war, but it's really the Syrian government fighting a variety of outside powers who are providing manpower, weapons, money, and other assistance. The United States was very effective at providing internet capacity, cameras, the satellite phones to upload film that was taken during these demonstrations and the violence that happened afterwards, to get this out to the world to help shape a narrative that Bashar al-Assad's regime was a brutal regime that needed to be brought down. The CIA played a heavy role in funding these activities. And so, again, my point is much of what we call opposition to Bashar al-Assad was foreign-backed, not of domestic origin. And this led to a broader conflict, one that Syria was not prepared to win in. Their military performed poorly and was beaten back on all fronts, to the extent that by 2014, 2015, it looked like the Assad regime was going to fall and the black flag of radical Islam was going to be raised over Damascus. Syria was saved by the intervention of Iran and Russia. Iran had been supporting Syria from the very beginning, but there was a limit to what Iran could bring to bear on the battlefield. They needed a superpower support. And Qasem Soleimani flew to Moscow in summer of 2015 and appealed to the Russians to intervene on behalf of their Syrian allies. And Russia agreed to. They sent an air force, some ground troops. But this air force, when combined with the Iranians bolstering the Syrian ground forces with IRGC forces, with Iranian commanders, with proxies from Afghanistan and Iraq, they were able to turn the tide on the battlefield. A lot of people believed, and this is one of the reasons why I went through this, a lot of people believed that victory was done by the Syrian army. There were certain Syrian army formations that performed well. The Tiger Force, the 4th Armored Division, they did well. But for the most part, the bulk of the Syrian army only functioned when they had Russian air support and Iranian or Hezbollah stiffeners assigned to them. Otherwise, they tended to be very passive and to retreat and give up battles. They weren't very successful. But this failure to perform was overlooked by many in the West because of the outcome that was achieved by Russia and Iran. So that when in 2018, 19, 20, as this war wound down, as Syria reasserted sovereign control, many in Syria and out of Syria had, I think, a higher opinion of Bashar al-Assad in Syria than maybe Syria warranted. The corruption that existed in Syria when Bashar al-Assad took place never went away. In fact, when the sanctioning of Syria took place by the United States, severe sanctioning, all it does is enhance the corruption because you create a black market environment, which is really an economy that runs outside of the rule of law. This black market is taken over by the corrupt generals and the officers, enriching themselves, and in doing so, de-incentivizing any reason to reform. They're making money. They like this situation. The people suffering are the Syrian people, but the government is not suffering, and Bashar al-Assad is the president of this corrupt government. Russia made an effort in 2018 to reform the Syrian military, recognizing that it was fundamentally broken, and it was rebuffed by Bashar al-Assad, who I think believed that this was the military that kept him in power. These were loyal officers from his perspective, and they were also the people that he leaned on for advice, and he just wasn't in the mood to do the kind of top-to-bottom cleaning that the Russians said had to be done. And so he said no. The Iranians came in and made an effort to send more forces to Syria, recognizing that the Syrian army was fundamentally broken and couldn't fight without these stiffeners. And Russia said no because they had promised Israel and indirectly the United States that they would not allow this assistance to sustain Assad turn into Iran transforming Syria into a springboard of resistance against Israel. And so the Iranians were rebuffed. And therefore, what we have left is a Syrian military that's fundamentally broken, but nobody recognized it, outside of the Russians and the Iranians as being broken. The West didn't, and the Syrians didn't. But this was an army that just had lost all faith with the government and therefore the nation. People need to remember that Syria is an artificial nation state. It was crafted by the French in the aftermath of World War I, when France was given a mandate by the League of Nations to resolve this. The French brought in a Saudi king, Faisal, to rule. A Saudi king to rule over this thing called Syria. Much of what is known as Syria, especially the Vilayet of Aleppo, was considered to be Turkish by the Turks themselves. Ataturk, the founder of Turkey, when seeking to define the territorial boundaries of Turkey in 1919, in the 1920s, basically said that Aleppo is part of Turkey. And it indeed, all the way up until the 1930s, the Turks were always threatening to annex Aleppo and bring it into Turkey. They believe Aleppo is a Turkish city. The Kurds, likewise, the Kurdish part of Syria is just basically Kurdistan that has been divvied up between Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. It's an artificial entity. We have the Alawite community, a minority that backed the Ba'athist revolutionaries. We have Sunni majority who are fractured into tribes whose tribal loyalty isn't to Damascus but to other regional centers. So Syria is not a state that people grow up and say, this is my country. It's not the United States that I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. Syria is a fake country with a leader that the people has lost faith in and a system that the people no longer supported. And so when HTS, this Turkish-backed terrorist organization, let's be frank who HTS is and who their leader is, Jolani. Jolani is a Saudi-born al-Qaeda operative who came to Iraq after the U.S. invasion of Iraq and helped create al-Qaeda in Iraq and began fighting Americans. He has the blood of American soldiers on his hands. He was then sent to Syria, where he was the deputy of al-Baghdadi, the founder of ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, and was there when ISIS expanded and swept through Syria into Iraq, creating its caliphate. He then jumped ship to the al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria called al-Nusra Front, and he's gone through a series of rebrandings ever since. The most latest one is, of course, HTS, which is, again, an al-Qaeda affiliate. So we have this al-Qaeda operative who's heading up a force of 20 to 30,000 well-trained, well-equipped Turkish fighters. These are fighters from they're Uyghurs from China, they're Turkmen, from the former Soviet Central Asian Republic, and they've come to Idlib, recruited by Israeli intelligence, to create a Turkish sub-state because Turkey believes that Idlib, like Aleppo, is Turkish. And so they're trying to alter the demographics. But this force, in the final phases of the fighting in 2020, Russia and Syria, recognizing after the liberation of Aleppo that they needed to connect Aleppo to Hama and other cities, they had asked, the Turks and the Russians were supposed to jointly patrol a highway, the M4 highway, but HTS kept ambushing these convoys. So the Russians and the Syrians and the Iranians launched a counteroffensive, and they liberated the M4 highway, became a Russian control or a Syrian controlled highway. It's believed that the initial HTS attack this time was simply an attack focused on recapturing the M4 highway. They did, but what they noticed is the Syrian army melted away. And so they had these sleeper cells inside Aleppo that came out and started wandering the town. And they said, look, we're in control. There's nobody here. Nobody's resisting us. So HTS came in and they took Aleppo. Fell like that. HTS then says, well, how far can we go? And they just kept pushing. And everywhere they went, the Syrian army had made a decision that it was done. They weren't going to get involved in another war of this nature. They were finished. That Syria wasn't the nation that they wanted to fight and die for. And so the army basically disintegrated. This led to the rapid defeat of Syria. The Russians and the Iranians were caught out. They recognized that the Syrian army wasn't capable of, sustained fighting similar to what had occurred during the 8 years of fighting. But no one expected this to happen. Nobody expected this to happen. No one in the West expected this to happen. Israel didn't expect this to happen. Iran didn't. Russia didn't. Turkey didn't. HTS didn't. I mean, this took them by surprise. The biggest proof positive that this was all something that was unplanned is the fact at the end of the day, it was Giuliani himself who sat on the throne in Damascus. The Turks had backed the Syrian National Army, a different military formation that is often at odds with HTS. And the Syrian National Army had a political component, a Syrian government in exile that the Turks have been working with. If this was a Turkish master plan, then the Syrian government in exile would be in power in Damascus. But they're not. The people in control of Damascus is Giuliani and the HTS, who have turned to not Turkey, not the Syrian National Army, but the HTS governing authority in Idlib to come in and take over. So that to me proves that nobody knew that this was happening. It's purely a reaction on the part of all parties involved to the collapse of Syria. But this is speculation. Bashar al-Assad is alive. He has fled to Moscow. And I understand he will be practicing dentistry going forward. I think another big problem that happened is that Bashar al-Assad, in rejecting the Russians and the Iranians, believed that he would be invited back into the ranks of the Arab League, and this would offset the failure to reform and the failure and the refusal of allowing Iran to have a significant posture inside Syria. And Bashar al-Assad, over the course of the last several months and years, has traveled extensively to Arab nations. He has traveled to Riyadh, where he's been invited to conferences and shook the hand of Saudi leaders. He's traveled to other Gulf Arab states where he's been well received. And one of the things that happened is that these Arab states agreed to help finance the restructuring and reconstruction of Syria. But when you start pouring in hundreds of millions and eventually billions of dollars for the reconstruction into a system that is so corrupt, there was no reform. So this money comes in, instead of being set aside to actually do the job it was supposed to do, all it did is further enrich these corrupt generals and these corrupt politicians. And it's that vulnerability. Once you start introducing foreign money and people started accepting it in violation of the law, that's a compromising situation. And I believe that the CIA and other intelligence services took advantage of the greed of many politicians and generals in Syria to buy them, to purchase their acquiescence in the face of conflict, to control them. And I believe many of these people believed that when Syria fell, that they would be called upon to step in and help govern. And instead, what happened is HTS came in and murdered them, beheaded them, executed them, slaughtered them. And that's, again, just shows you the total chaos here, that there may have been a plan in place to do something down the road, but nobody anticipated the rapid advance of HTS and the success of HTS and the downfall of Syria. And everything that's happened since then is purely a reaction.
Mit dem Zusammenbruch des syrischen Staates ist im Nahen Osten ein Machtvakuum entstanden, das alle Abenteurer ermutigt. So rückt die israelische Armee in den Golanhöhen weiter vor. Der israelische Ministerpräsident Benjamin Netanjahu spricht von einer historischen Gelegenheit. Die neu eroberten Gebiete sollen auf ewig zu Israel gehören. Längst werden die Stimmen wieder lauter, die ein Groß-Israel fordern. Auf Social Media schreibst auch du, dass Israel nun mit einer völlig neuen Situation konfrontiert ist. Ist die Achse des Widerstandes zerbrochen? Hat sich Israel von einer drohenden strategischen Niederlage befreit? Steht Netanjahu nun als strahlender Sieger da, als Mastermind, der die Lage seit dem 7. Oktober 2023 bis zum heutigen Tag manövriert hat?
Well, that certainly is how Netanyahu is selling himself. He is, of course, the ultimate political opportunist and survivor. But the reality is that prior to this HTS offensive, Netanyahu was strategically defeated. The ceasefire that happened in Lebanon was not in anticipation of the HTS advance. It was imposed by the fact that the Israeli military was exhausted and couldn't keep up this fight. It was also a byproduct of the fact that Lebanon was exhausted, and that Hezbollah was in a very difficult position, brought on by the Israeli bombardment of Beirut that was killing thousands of Lebanese, that was creating conditions inside Lebanon where the Lebanese people and government that had previously supported Hezbollah's actions in support of Hamas were now saying that enough is enough. We aren't a party to this conflict, and we need this conflict to end. Hezbollah isn't just a resistance organization, it's a political party that actively participates in the governing of Lebanon. And so when you have domestic political pressures coming from Lebanon proper, Hezbollah must respond and be responsive to that. And you combine that with the fact that they had, Hassan Nasrallah is no longer the leader. He was a very capable leader in power since 1992. They don't have him anymore. And so they're relying on people who aren't as experienced and savvy to negotiate these very difficult political situations. And so they erred on the side of a ceasefire. The same thing with the resistance establishment. They hadn't been defeated. Just ask the Golani Brigade and the 7th Armored Brigade and anybody else who fought in southern Lebanon. Hezbollah was fighting like tigers, but they did lose a lot of middle management in the infamous pager attack, and senior management had been decimated by the Israelis. And there was a belief that maybe a pause in the fighting, a ceasefire, could enable them to reorganize, restructure, re-equip. The key aspect to re-equipping, though, was that Hezbollah would maintain a line of communication with Iran from which these weapons would be sent. Iran previously had sent them in via truck through Iraq, northern Iraq, crossing at Al-Qaim and the Syrian town of Abu Kamal, and then driving across the desert to Homs before where the material would be put into warehouses and then distributed into Lebanon to Hezbollah. Other material would be flown in by Iranian aircraft and land at Damascus. The collapse of Syria has broken this land line of communication and the air line of communication. Right now, there's zero ability for Iran to re-equip Hezbollah, and this has created a very, very new reality for Hezbollah going forward, one that is very good for Israel, because Israel had not been able to defeat Hezbollah. But now, with the umbilical cut with Iran, and given the political situation in Lebanon, and the fact that a power vacuum has been created through the collapse of Bashar al-Assad's government, Hezbollah, I believe, is going to be put in a situation where it will eventually need to separate the resistance functions from the political governance functions, and that the resistance function will be transferred over to Lebanese army control. And this is the end of the axis of resistance in Lebanon. The political party will be more focused on governing and taking care of Lebanon's Shia population, and not so much about carrying out a war of attrition against Israel in support of Hamas. Iran now is isolated. One of the key things that Iran always had in confronting Israel was the existence of this very capable Hezbollah force that basically served as the loaded pistol pressed up against Israel's head. Because of the collapse of Syria, I think that's the end of this Hezbollah role. Hezbollah, as I said, will now be something that will be transformed into a domestic military capability and a domestic political entity, and not seeking to basically their policies will start to align with that of the Lebanese government, which seeks peaceful coexistence with Israel, not armed conflict. Iran now is isolated. Iran's also going through a very interesting period of time right now. The death of President Raisi, opened the door for Iran's own domestic political grievances to be played out politically. And the will of the people was manifested in the election of this new Iranian president, who is, while still a product of the establishment, is more inclined to support the betterment of relations with the West. And indeed, many people say that his role is in moderating the IRGC is what has prevented Iran from launching True Promise 3, the large, much anticipated strike against Israel using over 1,000 missiles. And he did this because he wants to create the opportunity for better relations with the West, in particular the United States. And so Iran's strategic priorities, now that Syria has collapsed, I think are in the process of being re-examined. This is why there's a lot of silence and confusion coming out of Iran. So when you take all of that, now we come back to Benjamin Netanyahu, who was politically and militarily defeated, suddenly being the opportunist he is, declaring victory, because his goal was to defeat Hamas. But Hamas couldn't be defeated so long as Hezbollah was providing this escalatory managed war of attrition. And Iran was standing by with a giant hammer to strike Israel. Netanyahu himself was under extreme political attack even before the October 7th, 2023 incursion. He was being, massive demonstrations were being organized because he had tried to alter Israeli basic laws, so he could not be charged and tried on reasonable charges of corruption. I mean, the fact is, there's a high likelihood that if he ever is tried by an Israeli court, he will be found guilty and spend the rest of his life in jail. Now October 7th goes around. Again, most honorable people would have resigned because the blame is with Netanyahu. But he then embarked on a path, very selfish path, but that said that he is the most powerful, or the most, he is capable of providing for the security of Israel more than anybody else. And that, he is the key. Without him, Israel will fail. He must be allowed to remain in power so he can achieve this strategic victory. And he was failing. People asked me when the ceasefire was in, I said, this is problems for Netanyahu because he now has his weak status has allowed other people to come at him. He was being attacked on a number of fronts by the Israeli court system, by politicians, by the military. At one point, people were talking about a potential coup being launched against Netanyahu. And literally overnight, he's now at the Golan Heights, proclaiming a strategic victory against the axis of resistance, Hezbollah and Iran, because of the collapse of Syria. And now he has aggressively moved into this vacuum that exists in Syria, annexing the totality of the Golan Heights, including, moving to occupy the totality of the Golan Heights, I believe with an eye on annexation. His air force has been unleashed over Syria, destroying the totality of Syria's military infrastructure. The tanks, the missiles that had been, stored by Bashar al-Assad's military I think the decision was made that the Israelis will not allow any of these weapons to fall in the hands of HTS or these other entities or somehow get free on the market. So they destroyed them. And Israel today is a much changed political situation. A geopolitical situation. The threats that existed are gone. Hamas, sadly, will probably not survive now because Hamas needed this war of attrition and they needed continued Iranian assistance. It's going to be very difficult to continue to supply Hamas. I think Israel now emboldened will move forward with policies that will be increasingly violent against the Palestinian people. And the one force in the world that was starting to stand up to this Israeli genocide against Palestine, the Biden administration lost an election where a new guy, Donald Trump, is going to come in, who's surrounded himself with a cabal of Zionists, all of whom say that they are greenlighting Israel doing whatever it takes to establish the greater Israel that Israel wants. So, yeah, Israel today has won. They are in the catbird seat. You can never, as events showed, you can't say what the future holds. We don't know if there's other surprises out there waiting to happen. What we do know is that Israel today, of all the players in the region, with the exception of maybe Turkey, is positioned to say we have won a strategic victory. And Netanyahu will take credit for that, which now I think solidifies his position as not only the leader of Israel, but also the right-wing coalition that he had, which everybody, including myself, believes was on the verge of collapse, has now been strengthened. There's going to be harsher policies. There's going to be cleansing of the West Bank. Gaza will be depopulated, repopulated with Israelis who are bragging about how they're going to buy beachside property. This is the new reality. This is an utter tragedy for the Palestinian people and the cause of a Palestinian state.
Der Sturz der Regierung von al-Assad löste im Westen wahre Jubelstürme aus. Bundeskanzler Olaf Scholz spricht plötzlich von der Würde aller Syrer. US-Präsident Joe Biden nannte es einen Akt der Gerechtigkeit und einen Wendepunkt der Geschichte. In den Westmedien wird der Anführer der HTS, Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, als Befreier und als netter Islamist tituliert. Seine Vergangenheit als ehemaliger Kommandeur von Al-Qaida und Islamischen Staat lachte al-Jawlani jüngst im CNN-Interview als Jugendsünden weg. Man könnte formulieren, der Westen paktiert nun offen mit Al-Qaida und dem Islamischen Staat, alles um Russland und Iran eine geopolitische Niederlage zuzufügen. Sind den USA dafür alle Mittel recht? Und wie sieht es die US-Bevölkerung, dass nun die Fahnen von Al-Qaida und IS siegreich in Damaskus wehen? Und was ist mit al-Jawlani, auf dem das FBI einst ein Kopfgeld von 10 Millionen US-Dollar ausgesetzt hat?
Well, I think we have to be careful about inferring knowledge and insight on the cheers of Americans when somebody they've targeted for regime change falls. Saddam Hussein was removed from power in 2003, captured and ultimately executed. The Iraq today that exists today is a fundamentally broken Iraq because of that. Muammar Gaddafi was the ruler of Libya. Libya thrived under his rule. Poverty was eliminated, healthcare was good, jobs were guaranteed, high standard of living, and the West removed Muammar Gaddafi. And look at Libya today, a divided nation in perpetual civil war that has destroyed its ability to unify and to rebuild. That's the future of Syria. It's absurd to talk about any sort of victory for democracy, victory for Western values. Jawlani is Jawlani. He's al-Qaeda. As we speak, Syrians are being beheaded right now in Syria, being slaughtered. Women are being raped. Christians are being persecuted, shot, butchered. This is the reality of life under the black flag of radical Islam. And I just think in the not too distant future, you're going to find that these cheers will be replaced by anger, and the United States will find itself in a situation where it will probably be compelled to intervene militarily, except we have a president coming in who doesn't want to do that sort of thing, which means the void of American military intervention, Jawlani will run rampant for a while. I'm very concerned about a new caliphate effort where you'll see Jawlani take advantage of the situation in Iraq to mobilize the Sunni population against the Shia-governed Iraq. I think you're going to see the Kurds find once again that the world doesn't share their aspirations for a Kurdish state, and they will be abandoned. Russia was in Syria at the invitation of the Assad government. Right now, with the Assad government no longer in place, Russia has no legal justification for sustaining this mission. And unless Russia and this new Syrian government can, articulate something, a mission for Russia, you'll probably see Russian troops going home. And as far as Iran goes, the Sunni majority in Syria, backed by the fighters out of Idlib, there's no role for Iran in this kind of Syria. So I think you're going to see the strategic retreat of Iran as well. They've already retreated. Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, gave an address at at Friday prayers recently, or maybe not Friday prayers, yesterday or so, when he talked about the future and what can happen in the future. But the bottom line is the present is the problem, and Iran has no answer for what's going on and how it's going to effectively respond. The big winner in all of this, besides Israel, appears to be Turkey, and Turkey had been sidelined, compelled to enter into an agreement, the Astana Accords, that it didn't support because those didn't further the national security objectives of Turkey. Turkey now will preserve Idlib as a Turkic rump state. They're going to forcefully expel the 5 million Syrian refugees that were hanging around Erdogan's neck because of domestic political pressure to get rid of them. I believe Turkey will eventually annex Aleppo and Idlib, and maybe take with it a portion of the Turkish-Syrian border regions where the Kurds currently are, just to ensure that there is a buffer zone between Turkey proper and whatever Kurdish autonomy may exist in Syria down the road. But Turkey's a big winner, Israel's a big winner, and virtually everybody else, especially the Syrian people, are the big losers.
Sowohl US-Präsident Joe Biden als auch US-Verteidigungsminister Lloyd Austin sprachen jüngst von einem Wendepunkt der Geschichte, an dem die Entscheidungen der USA den Ausgang der kommenden Jahrzehnte formen würde. Austin machte deutlich, die Welt, die durch die amerikanische Führung aufgebaut wurde, kann nur durch die amerikanische Führung aufrechterhalten werden. Amerika darf an diesem Wendepunkt der Geschichte nicht wanken. Wie bewertest du diese Aussagen? Müssen die USA alles daran setzen, um die amerikanische Führung über die Welt aufrechtzuerhalten?
Well, that certainly was the vision of the Biden administration, whose national security strategy was built around the premise that the United States needed to lead using the framework of the so-called rules-based international order. Now, I listened to Biden's statements and Austin's statements very carefully, and well, in the past there were, significant American funding and role played by the CIA and the U.S. military to try and bring about the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad. In recent years, this has diminished. What Biden is calling leadership is, I believe, more reflective of a reactionary mode by the United States, reacting to issues instead of leading from the front. I believe the United States was as surprised by what happened in Syria as anybody, that this wasn't part of this outcome as it happened wasn't part of an American plan. America may have been planning in the future to create the conditions for the collapse of Bashar al-Assad, but I don't think anybody believed that those conditions existed today, especially in the way that they were manifest. Lloyd Austin is looking at a shrinking U.S. military presence in Syria now. Logic dictates with this kind of instability that you would want to increase American military presence just for force security measures alone. But the problem is Austin isn't going to be Secretary of Defense much longer, and Biden isn't going to be president much longer, and they're going to be replaced by a man who wants out of Syria. And based upon the initial social media response by Donald Trump, it's clear that even recognizing the catastrophe that has befallen Syria, Trump has said it's not America's problem and that he still intends to get American troops out of there. So, Biden and Austin and Blinken can all go to whatever events they want, stand there and look confident and declare victory. On January 20th, they are going to be removed from office and replaced by a man who, as things stand today, does not want to get involved in a quagmire type situation in Syria. So I think we're going to see a completely different foreign policy under Trump than we're currently witnessing under Biden when it comes to Syria and the Middle East.
Liebe Zuschauer, wenn euch unsere Beiträge gefallen, teilt sie unbedingt in den sozialen Medien. Abonniert unseren Kanal und drückt auf die Glocke, damit ihr keine Veröffentlichung von Gegenpol verpasst.